And joining the PHLY Flyers show, we have Alex Appleyard, regular contributor here at PHLY, also writes for Smart Scouting. Alex and I have worked together for quite a while, dating back to my time at the Athletic. He is, as I'm sure all of you know, a prospect watcher and scout extraordinaire. Alex, thanks so much for joining us today.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be on.
Yeah, happy we could get you on one of these shows. The work you've been doing for us since we launched has been great, but so far it's just been on the written side. So really good to get you on the show for a segment with, of course, the NHL Draft coming up at the end of the month. Now, for those that maybe aren't as familiar with Alex's work, he's been studying prospects for at least a decade, if not longer.
I think it's, properly, probably a decade, but I've been watching hockey now for like almost as long as I've been alive, so almost 30 years or something. And yeah, prospects have always been kind of the area where I always just like enjoyed watching younger players and seeing development. I think it kind of runs in my family. Like my great uncle's a professional soccer scout, and yeah, so always had that kind of like how players develop, like what makes a player go from like a good junior player to a good pro in the back of my mind. So yeah, and now it's become, well, semi part-time job, I think.
Exactly. No, I just remember the days before I was even at the Athletic and just being on Twitter and always really valuing your insights that you would put on there about prospects, about the Flyers in general. And then obviously when I joined the Athletic, it was like I want Alex to be one of the regular contributors, and here we are. But with regards to this draft, as you said, you've been scouting drafts for over a decade. You've been a hockey fan basically your entire life. Where would you say this draft falls in terms of quality relative to, the last 10 plus years worth of drafts?
I would say overall, it's probably a slightly above average draft. And I think people are slightly down on this draft in some ways simply because of the quality of drafts we've had in the last few years, where you've effectively had like a generational player or potentially two in some drafts like we saw last year. And next year is also probably a stronger draft than this as well. But I do think on overall it's above average. And I would say that really the strength of it is carried by the defenseman. I think the quality of a defenseman in this draft is potentially up there, I think, with maybe like 2018 or so as like one of the better drafts for defensemen. Or even 2015, where there was like quite a lot of guys who came out as good players. I don't think it's quite the level of like the 2008 draft where there was just like defenseman after defenseman after defenseman, and lots of them became number one D-men. But I think this draft's going to have great potential on the back end, and I think the weakness is really kind of at the center position actually, in terms of both kind of top end and some level of depth. There are a group of really good centers, but then there's kind of in the middle of the first round, it kind of really falls off a cliff. And I think there's only probably going to be about 4, potentially 5 guys in this entire draft who have like clear top 6 center upsides, 1C or a 2C. So overall, I would say it's above average, but I can understand why people are slightly down on it versus others.
Gotcha. Yeah, because it definitely seems like there isn't the same level of excitement, but maybe in comparison to, and maybe this was influenced just by the top of the draft, but I'm thinking back to the 2022 draft when the Flyers took Gauthier, like that seemed to be viewed as a weaker draft, especially at the top end. And then last year was viewed, at least in my memory, as a very strong one.
Yeah, exactly. So I would say, yeah, just above average, nothing bad, nothing amazing. But I do think the defensemen in this draft I think if you look back in 10 years, there'll be so many NHL defensemen who came from this draft, and not just first rounders as well, guys who are taken in the second, third, and fourth, because there are so many good guys in defensive roles.
Gotcha. Well, obviously for Flyers fans, and not their only focus, but the main focus is going to be on pick number 12. That's the top pick. It's where you have the highest likelihood of getting an impact guy who can be, maybe that top of the lineup, high-end talent that this team so desperately needs. You've done a ton of work on this draft. You have opinions on so many of the guys in this draft. But if you're looking at realistic preferences, obviously you'd love for the Flyers to get Macklin Celebrini. That's not going to happen. But if we're talking about realistic preferences at 12, give me your top 3 options.
I would say in terms of realistic, maybe I'm optimistic on all 3 of them. I think there's a world where none of them are going to get to 12. But I think for me, it would be Berkeley Catton, Costa Helenius, and Zane Parak. I think all 3 of them have a chance to get to 12, and I would say it's like 50-50 that one of them does. And I think those three guys are semi-realistic and probably the best the Flyers could do pretty much in this draft, given the quality of players and also how the draft is probably going to roughly fall.
So you're definitely a Berkeley Catton fan. What is the what's the selling point for you on him that makes him your ideal, I guess, top option?
I mean, for me, it's just what I look for generally in a center is two things that he has in spades, and that's being high skilled and also having a really high hockey IQ. I really love the way that he controls the game. You know, people talk about him being extremely deceptive and having plus speed and really great hands and a good shot and a good passer. But the things that really define his game for me is he's fantastic in transition and incredible at creating space. And he's one of those players, which I think a lot of the top centers in the NHL have, where he dictates the pace of play when he's on ice. You know, if he wants to speed things up, he'll speed things up. If he wants to slow things down, he'll slow things down. But in general, he does play with like quite a high pace through the neutral zone, transitions the puck really well. And his IQ is extremely high. And from a skill perspective, I think personally, only Celebrini and Demidov are more skilled than him in the draft. He might not kind of have the real highlight reel moves that they do, but he can beat men one-on-one, has really plus hands. And I quite like the way he beats guys. He usually goes quite direct, like just does one move, makes them, you know, take a misstep and then goes past them. So he's probably my top option that the Flyers could potentially have. And if it was me, you know, in an NHL front office, he would be in my top 5 in the entire draft, potentially as high as 3, although I would maybe take one or two of the defensemen over him. But yeah, he's, I think, the best the Flyers can possibly do. And I know a few months ago, you know, if you said Berkeley Captain, someone would say like, well, there's no chance he's getting to 12. But I think a really good, you know, look at the draft in general is like the TSN guys like Bob McKenzie and Craig Button, whether you agree with their opinion or disagree with their opinion, in general, it aligns quite closely usually with how NHL teams are thinking because they speak to NHL scouts and NHL GMs. And I think McKenzie has him at 10 and Button has him at 14. So the ability for him to fall to 12 is realistic. And I think as we've seen draft after draft after draft, guys with that kind of profile who are skilled, put up a lot of points, but are, you know, 5'10", it's not out of the realms of possibility that he's going to fall because we saw that with Benson. We saw that with, Chris Stell last year, who fell enormously. It happens every draft or every 2 drafts. So I think there's a potential for him to be there, and I think that is really best case scenario.
And then another guy who you mentioned is your number 2, which is interesting to me, is Constance Helenius. Obviously, you do a ton of work on the European side, so I'm sure you've seen a bunch of him. The concern that I've had with him, and this is something that we talked to Chris Peters last week, and he mentioned as well, is just the idea of what is his upside. It seems clear he's going to be a good player. Can he be a great player? And I think there's some skepticism there. Do you think that he could have top of the lineup upside?
Yeah, I think there's potential there for him to be a number 1 center. I don't think there's the potential for him to be, you know, a standout top 10 center in the NHL, but I think there's a chance for him to be a kind of guy who puts up 75 to 85 points in, you know, a good year. And if your team has him as your number 1 C, you're not going to be ecstatic, but You're going to be like, okay, this guy can play that position and play it well. I think there's a lot of positives that are overlooked because it's true, he doesn't really have those standout specific skill sets apart from being extremely like intelligent on ice. Like he dictates play when he's on ice, and he plays a really mature game as well. And I think when you start watching him on a regular basis, you realize that it's kind of like the way he wins is just death by 1,000 cuts. Like he makes all the little plays correctly. He plays a very mature game despite not being the biggest guy. He drives play. He's a really good transition player, and I think his transition game is kind of overlooked because he's not the fastest and not the most skilled. And I also think this year he was kind of unlucky. You know, he put up really, really impressive figures, you know, 0.71 points per game in Liga, which is, you know, one of the top 5 men's leagues in the world, and then showed at the international level he could hang with guys who played in the NHL as well. But he only shot something like 6% this season, and he doesn't have a bad shot, you know. He's good at getting his shot off. I think he was a bit unlucky in that regard. And people do criticize his speed, but I think one of the interesting things, obviously, like speed and functional speed are different.
Sure.
But Liga do have like the smart puck technology. So we actually know what his top speed was this year, and it was 23.6 miles an hour, which is not slow. When he gets going, he can skate. So for me, I think if Catton wasn't there, I think he would be the best chance that the Flyers had in the draft to potentially get like a good top 6 center. And while I'm not one on, you know, really high floors are impressive. You know, for me, like if a guy is like only going to be a 45-point player in an NHL, you don't take that player 12th overall. You try and swing on someone higher, but I do think that he has a really high floor as well. You know, to go with potentially being a 1C. And I understand why some people don't think he's going to stick at C. I understand why they might think he's going to kick out to the wing. But the fact of the matter is, he did play center this year in Liga and did a really good job. So for me, he's not got the upside that Captain has, but he does have that potential to kind of just about get to 1C level and probably be, 15th, 20th best center in the league, which is nothing to sniff at in the position that is of most need really in the entire NHL and is the biggest scarcity really.
Yeah, it's a fair point. Looking at the, because obviously you're going to have different opinions on the consensus for a lot of guys, but if you're talking about the names that people know, the bigger name, well-known prospects, is there a bigger name player that you would say you're lower than what seems to be the industry consensus on?
I would say Silyev. I've watched a lot of Silyev, and there's people talking about a potential top 5 pick. And while I think his physical game's fantastic, he is a unicorn. You know, a guy at that size who skates that well and has above average puck skills, I would say, are really hard to come across. But for me, every time I watch him, I just see him being a really good second pairing NHL defenseman. And I think when you put that up against some of the other defensemen in this draft class, when you're talking about, Levshinov and Dickinson and Boom, and even a guy like Perek, I don't think he has the upside that they potentially do, unless he comes on leaps and bounds. There's people talking about him being the next Victor Hedman, but the matter of fact is that Victor Hedman in his draft year was a top pairing defenseman in the SAL, putting up over 0.5 points per game and looking better than most guys who played NHL and came back. Hedman is ahead of where Silyev is right now when he was 15 years old. In terms of his offensive game, in terms of his transition game. So he's the guy, he's going to be a good NHL player, but for me, he's more likely to be a number 4 or a number 3. And you saw that in the MHL playoffs. I was watching quite a bit of him in the junior playoffs. And for a guy who people are talking about as a top 5 pick, you don't expect someone to kind of go missing for such enormous periods of time and get beaten by junior players. It's not to say he doesn't have talent, but I think people are salivating more over the size than the skill set, really.
Gotcha. That's interesting. Yeah, because I know there was a lot of theorizing, I feel like, in the beginning of the draft of the year, that the Flyers, given their love of, their professed love for size on the back end, that he could potentially be a guy that Jones and Briere might love. Now I feel like the general consensus is that he's almost certainly not going to be there at 12, but it seems like in your mind that might actually be a good thing.
Yeah, I think so. I think that there'll be defensemen with higher upside available at 12 for the Flyers, most likely.
Moving to the second first-round pick. Now, obviously, we don't yet know whether that's going to be 31 or 32. It's going to depend upon how Florida does in the Cup final. Off to a decent start, up 1-0, but given the fact that Edmonton outshot them like crazy, that series could turn real quick. So we don't know exactly what pick, but we know it's one of those picks. Let's hear, again, asking for your top 3 realistically. Most likely you're not going to have one of those top guys. A Constellanes is going to slip to 31 or 32. But in terms of realistic possibilities of guys who you think might actually be there, who would you say your top 3 options are?
I mean, my clear number 1 is Nikita Artamonov. I can't believe that he's potentially seen as a guy who falls out of the first round, if I'm honest. I think it's madness. And I'm being very strong-worded there, but it's happened before with some of these Russian prospects that for one reason or another, they've just continued to fall despite doing things that are preposterous. And what he's done this year is really, really impressive. And I don't think maybe people understand just how impressive it is. He put 23 points up in 54 games while not playing big minutes in the KHL for a team who, while they value young players and they do play young players in big minutes, aren't an exceptionally good team. When you look at what he did this year, only Michkov, Tarasenko, and Panarin are the only players in the KHL's 15-year history to do better point per game wise. And it's not like he's a guy who's this all flash, no substance player who's just, he's not a less talented Nikolai Zherdev, for example. This is a guy who's kind of a workhorse in a lot of ways. He's not this small, skilled Russian winger who only plays in the offensive zone. He's like an Energizer bunny, voracious on the forecheck, diligent in defensive zone, has an active stick, disrupts lanes. And while he's not super physical, he's really happy to go to corners, go to the net front. And alongside that, he's a great skater and a great passer. He's really good at getting free ice. So, for me, the only real downside with him is that his shot isn't fantastic. I would say in some ways, and some people might disagree with me here, he's kind of like a smaller Mikhail Bransenigor in the way he plays the game. You know, he's a guy who, even if he doesn't hit as a first-line winger or a second-line winger, you could plug him in your middle six, and if he only put up 40 points, playing a kind of energy role on a wing, people would love him. So he's my guy who it just baffles me that he's not penciled in as a top 20 pick in this draft. So he'd be my number one. And then the other two guys, I would say are less well-rounded and have more problems. But for me, I still, if the Flyers are picking at 31 or 32 and he's there, Aaron Kiviharju, he's fell enormously. You know, 2 years ago, if anyone said Aaron Kiviharju, everyone would be like, oh yeah, the potential number one pick in the 2024 draft. And now it's looking like he might fall out of the first round entirely. And I can see why. You know, his physical skills are not impressive. Like, he's small, he doesn't skate very well. I mean, he's not a bad skater, but he doesn't skate great. But for me, like, he's got a really high IQ, and he's got really, really impressive kind of skills in general. So in terms of upside, yeah, he's a guy who there's a danger he doesn't even become an NHL player. Totally acknowledge that. He might just be a good EuroLeague player or kind of like a top AHLer, because I doubt he's less than that. But if you're talking about swings, and the Flyers do need high-skilled players, I do think there's still the potential for him to be maybe not a number one defenseman, but a number 2, 3 defenseman, because his hockey IQ is better than a lot of NHL players already. He's still 2 steps ahead of the play, even without, you know, having great skating. And he does have like great vision, good passing, pretty silky hands, means he's like a good transition player as well. And it's not like he's bad defensively. You know, he's pretty strong down low with an active stick. So while I see the holes and I see the concerns with a late first round pick, he's a guy who I would really consider in such a spot. And I would say then the final guy that I would really think about late on, who is generally regarded as a second rounder in this draft, is Luke Misa. He's another guy who's a bit undersized. You know, his little brother is in contention for number 1 pick next year, Michael Misa. But what I like about Luke is he plays like a really high tempo game, like really good on the forecheck, drives off the rush, and he's also a good passer and plays at a high pace. I don't think he's a guy who's going to be a first-line player or has a real potential to be a first-line player, but for me, he could be a 50-point player, and they're really difficult to get once you get past kind of 20th overall. He's a guy in a funny way who I can imagine him ended up like somewhere around the level of someone like Luke Evangelista, another guy who fell kind of a bit later in the draft than he probably should have done, has a high talent level, good work ethic, plays an up-tempo game, and is, a bit undersized. So they would really be my 3. And the thing with Misa is, even though, you know, he can play center and he has played center at times this year, I do think he's a winger going forward. But they'd be my 3 guys to watch out for in the late first round.
Yeah, with Kiviharju, it's interesting because I guess this is when it kind of comes down to, because I like him too. I don't know if I would take him with a late first, not because I don't think he's a first round caliber prospect, but because everything I'm reading is saying that he very well could slip to the second. And this is where, you know, you wonder, you don't want to get too cute, but also if he's a guy you like, do you think you can get someone else with that late first and then maybe get him with your pick in the second round instead, you know?
Yeah, I have a hard time seeing him falling all the way to 51.
Yeah.
I don't think he will, because I don't think he'll fall that far. I think someone's just going to go, well, you know, when you look at the defensemen who are lining up, once you get past the guys like Alphonse Frey, etc., there aren't many guys I think who have that kind of upside. So I do think that the latest he's probably going to fall is like 40 something. So I do think if the Flyers were going to get him, they'd have to either draft him late first or maybe trade down with that first and get an early second instead.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's possible. I know from what I've talked to, you know, the people around the Flyers, they're assuming that Columbus is going to keep their pick, but I guess it's possible that Columbus gives up that early second and then they have an early second round pick as well, and maybe he's a fit there. Alex, this has been great. I guess one last question for you, and this really dates back to, you know, when we first started working together. You know, you've become someone who just knows everything about European prospects and really prospects in general. But I remember when we first started working together, your niche really was Swedish prospects. You knew the SHL, the Allsvenskan, the junior leagues better than anybody. This, for whatever reason, it seems like it's a weaker Swedish draft, especially in comparison to recent ones. I guess, why do you think that's the case? And do you think there are guys that maybe will surprise 4 or 5 years down the road from this class from Sweden?
Yeah, it's a weaker class for sure. I think part of that is simply just chance. because next year's Swedish class has a lot of really good players. It's got a lot of guys who have potential to be 70-plus point forwards. And I think this one, it's just kind of, there's a lot of guys who are probably going to be NHL players, but just really not many players who are going to go out and be top players. You know, I don't think there's going to be a Swedish player taken in the top 25 of this draft, most likely. You know, I think the highest guy who will be taken is probably Alphonse Frey, who he is a guy who I think can surprise. I think he's a guy who potentially could be a number 2-3 defenseman because he's incredible in transition and he has a really quite a well-rounded game. But there's been a few players who kind of fell off, I would say, in the last year. You have a guy like Edvin Nielsen, who is probably going to go in the mid-rounds, who up until this point last year was seen as a potential first-round pick. He was doing incredible things for HV71 as a 17-year-old, and he's just not really kicked on. And then you have a guy like Zetterberg as well, who 2 years ago was talked as a potential top 10, top 15 pick. And he hasn't grown. He's tiny. And on top of that, he hasn't quite kicked on to the next level that most players who you would expect to be first-round picks have. So I would say Frey is a fantastic player, and he could be a real surprise. And also Noah Franson. He's a guy who wasn't even ranked on Central Scouting's list. I imagine he'll probably go like third round or something like that. Fantastic offensive game. He has other things to clean up, and he's not the best skater in some ways. But he's also a guy who might surprise going forward. So they're the two I would pick out as one late first who might outkick his coverage, and then a guy who's probably going to go third round or so, who also might impress. And then there are guys like, a guy like Edvin Nielsen as well, who a few years down the line might be, a strong puck moving number 4 defenseman if he gets back to the level he was at 16. But overall, the Swedish crop this year, I think he's just going to end up having quite a few middle 6 forwards and number 4 defensemen, really. I don't think there's anyone who's likely to get to that 60-plus point forward or, number 2 defenseman level.
Yeah, it's just usually the Swedish class seem to be stronger. And, when I was doing my research, you had guys like Frey, you had Salem Wallenius, there's the Eriksson and Pettersson, the 2 potential centers. But beyond that, it just really didn't seem like there was anybody that were catching the scouts' eyes. And I know you watch a ton of those leagues. So
yeah, it's just a lot of kind of guys in a similar level. Like there's guys like Simon Zeth, Oscar Voulay, William Samuelson, who I think people he's probably going to go higher than a lot of people expect. He might go 100, 120 or something like that. But lots of these guys are just a similar level of, they might be third-line players. They might be number 4 or 5 defensemen. So there's not really many standouts from this Swedish class.
Gotcha. Well, Alex, thanks so much for joining us. We might have you on later this month when we get closer to the draft. I know that we're working on some content for you on the written side for our diehards, so keep an eye out for that as well. But Alex Appleyard, again, he's one of the best draft analysts out there in the public sphere. So check out his stuff both at PHLY and also at Smart Scouting. Thanks so much, Alex.
Yeah, pleasure, Charlie.
We all silly like the mayor.